Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the last lecture of the last Lubalin lecture of the summer. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the last. Sorry about that. That's the one thing they forgot to preview me on. I want to first thank Hoefler Co for their support of this lecture series of the archive and getting this live to you on YouTube and the Zoom webinar. And then I'd like to introduce the speaker today. So Petr van Blokland graduated cum laude from Graphic Arts program at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in The Hague. With his partner Claudia Mens, Van Blokland worked since 1980 as a designer in the studio they co-founded. His output ranges from sketching and model making to programming in various languages. He specializes in systemic design with an emphasis on typography, type, and corporate design. He's taught many years at the Academy of Fine Arts at Arnhem, TypeMedia at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in The Hague, and at Master Graphic Design at St. Bruce in Breda. He is co-founder of WebType and Type Network. His oldest typefaces, Proforma and Productus, originally released by Font Bureau, are now published by TYPETR at Type Network. Recent typefaces include Bitcount and Upgrade. His work brought him ATypI's coveted Charles Peignot Prize in 1988. New initiatives focus on design and production of typefaces, exploring the possibilities and limitations of variable fonts and the use of programming in the process of graphic design and typography. Recently, together with Claudia Mens, Design Space was founded, offering an online environment for design workshops and studies. And now please welcome Petr van Blokland.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction, Cara, and for the opportunity to speak at the Lubalin lecture series, second time in a different setting. But nevertheless, I hope still as joyful and informing. I prepared a lecture, and let's share screen before starting that. So this is visible. Okay, so we will be talking about design, and I always like to have that as an overall view. So we're not particularly talking about logo design, corporate design, or type design in particular. There's always a reference to teaching. I think being a designer and a teacher is there's very much overlap to that. And as teachers educating design, it is I think a responsibility for the teachers to make sure that design students can still do their work 20, 30, 40 years from now. And we have no idea what that future will be. So that's kind of an unsolvable problem. And in my experience, that the closest there is to focus on the process, the things that probably don't change. So one of the things in this lecture is the aspect of design that is, in my view, in my experience, not going to change pretty soon. The materials change, technology change, but the process itself has been there forever, and I think will be forever. Part of that whole discussion, what is design anyway, is that there's so much to definition, what do words means. If you watch my previous Lubalin lecture that was titled Words, that was entirely about definition of stuff. This focused more on two specific words, and one of them is what is design? And you can argue there's as many design definitions as there are designers, probably more. But for the sake of this presentation, this is what I would like to stick to. So a very wide range of and much more focused on the process than it is on the outcome. And this has always been a very workable definition with talking with students. You do something, and then if you didn't do it, it wasn't there. But if you do it, it is. And if you do it again, it gets better, or it might get better. And if it doesn't, then you go in another direction. There's another definition, which is the most important one in this lecture. We'll be looking at sketching a lot. And in that sense, a sketch is anything that you can afford to throw away and to start from scratch. So if you're in 3 weeks of InDesign work and there's so much work in it that you cannot afford to throw it away and do it again, then that's no longer called sketching. We're in production mode, trying to finish stuff. And one design project can have a very short sketching phase and a very long end of production, or the other way around. But as long as you can say, I'm trying this and I can do it again, if it doesn't work out very well, then for the sake of the definition in this lecture, that is sketching. So it's not about the tools. It's not about a pencil and paper in your sketchbook. Although we will see a lot of sketchbooks, scans, photos here. The sketch is something that is more part of the process than it is saying something about the material. You also see digital sketches in fitting this definition. So this is about sketching, and then the chapters are more or less separated into different topics. Of course, there's a lot of overlap, but also, again, for the sake of this presentation, I made some divisions. It's also a lot of time travel that was making this lecture, looking back into the history of the studio. Claudia and I started our studio in 1980, so this is more or less our 40th year of being designers, running a design studio, and we didn't do that alone. So over the years, we had over 25 people joining the studio longer and shorter periods of time. Because that's another thing. This is not a personal achievement. You can only do this together, and using each other's skills and focus and level of interest, and bringing that together. So anything we do, anything you see in this lecture is something that we made. It's not particularly that I did that. Even type, there's people helping, and there's a lot of sketches and a lot of illustrations that are made over the years. Another thing that made become visible is how sketching process changed over the years. So you'll see a lot of hand drawings, and we still do that a lot, although it's more in sketchbooks. But very early in the stage of the studio, we decided to standardize the sketching material, A3 tracing paper, thickest quality you can get. And many of these things, many of the sketches are really old. They're like 20 or 30 years old, and they're still there. They're like nothing changed. Investing in good material, if it's physical, is good. And the other funny thing is that those sketches that we now photographed are in much better shape than the digital files over that whole period, because we can't read them anymore. I don't have hardware that runs PageMaker or Quark to read those files. So I'll get you through some real assignments that we did, picking ones that are relatively old. One identity is 16 years old, the other is 22 years old, and they're still there. They're still more or less there. They're still alive, and which is also fun to see. That it's not true for every identity we did over the years, but these two are still there. So this is the current website. As we started, it was called Reuma Fonds, which is the foundation to get money for rheumatology research and also for patient groups. And so that started with the name. So I'll get you through the process. It is a selection in that sense. Making a presentation like this is also a design process. Kill your darlings. So the first version of the presentation was 3 times longer than this one is, and then you have to get rid of things that don't really matter, and then more and more and more, and you end up with something that is really dense and I hope interesting enough to sit through for an hour. So one of the investigations is starting on logo, and I keep saying logo for again in this presentation. We normally try to change that into designing an identity, because you may not know if it will become a logo at the end. There are a lot of other ways to make recognition, to people remember the name, which is nowadays called branding. A logo is a tool that's often used, but it's not necessarily the only tool. But since this is a little bit focused on type design, and we also focus more on the logo part of the identity than the whole visual grammar. So often the customer comes with the name, and that's one of the starting points. What is the name? What does it do? And it's one of the opportunities to make something unique, because the name by definition is unique, especially if it's a domain name. So type letter combinations, what is in it, and over the years we developed some models, and there are models from others that we use, and one of them is Jacques Breton. You can look him up. He's not necessarily a typographer, graphic designer. He's more a cartographer, but he used he made theory behind making graphs, and that became his 7 parameters of how to visualize different kind of information. It's a bit focused, so you don't see type or typeface in this 7. So for other usage, they may need some additions or transformations, but it's a good starting point. So these are the 7 parameters you can change, and if you keep the rest the same, you automatically get into a range of shapes that have a difference and they belong together. So that's particularly one thing you want to use in making graphs, but it's very useful in other ways too. So looking at parts of the word or particular letters, do you change the position of the letter, do you change the angle of the letter, or you change both? Is a way to, instead of randomly trying to modify parts of the word to make it unique. Those are ways of getting more structured way of a process in what part of the word, what part of the type are we going to change first, and you'll see later on that this is very close to, for instance, how type design works, where you have to make 2 different styles within the same family. What is the things that you're going to change? And if you change the angle parameter of Jacques Breton, you end up with an italic. So it's a useful tool. It is a tool. It's not guaranteed success. It's also not complete, but it helps. And one of the things is not looking at the type itself, but looking at it by shapes. That means that and that immediately shows the difference what you do if you draw this or you type it in Illustrator. Typing the word in Illustrator and then cutting something off, that is a very usual way of designing logos. But if you draw it, you see it in every stage. You can draw, you can fill in the space in between, or you can fill in half of the letter, you can leave out half the letter, or combine two letters over each other. Drawing in transparent paper like this, you have the previous version on top of it, and it gives a history of drawings instead of changing something in Illustrator and then saving it, which tends to be very much more a sequential process than a parallel process as it is here. If you change that to type, there's a lot more. So this is more like a diverted way of translating the 7 parameters of Jacques Breton into more specific parameters of type. Where Breton just says shape. If you translate it into type design, you can recognize the difference between capitals, Roman, and italic, and between the outlines and the counters and accents, and so there's all bunch more of subtle different parameters that can be used. So playing with the word, and it's almost a mantra. If you don't know what to do anymore, just draw it again, because something else will happen, and then do it over and over and over again. And that gives a pile of transparent papers. In the studio that always worked, we have a table and there's a stack of current projects, which means that there's just this pile of transparent drawings that people work on. And you can grab them, combine them, put them back. That also automatically makes this into something that we do. We had this idea. You can't say that this idea was mine and not yours. It's a collective making of people who have all kind of contributions. Even looking at it sometimes by coincidence, upside down or reversed, or having by coincidence 2 different versions on top of each other that give you new ideas. Those things tend to be more happening if it's a physical appearance. Although I'm totally into coding and programming, there is this part of the process where it delivers more ideas if you do it on in a physical way. So we have around 4 meters of bookshelf over these 40 years, where projects ended up in physical sketches like this, and then at some point got digitized and transformed into new media. Other questions: how much of the original logo should be there? Probably not, but that's always an idea that the customer brings to you if they don't want to suddenly change their whole identity. So you see all kind of variations, and it already is a bit of a design space. Are you going to change the weight? Are you going to change the width? You switch part of the letters from capitals to Roman? Do you cut them half away or partly drawing the reverse? Or you can pick out one letter. In this case, rheumatology is a large disease, so to say. There are many shapes, many forms, but they all have in common that they start with an R, and there's no other big disease that is starting with an R. So using the R as some kind of recognition is something to consider. You see different handwritings, different people working here on this at the same time, and then you never know where to end. You never know if it's possible to catch the enormous meaning of the topic, or you end up with something that is very close to a competitor, or to something that people already know, which has a totally different meaning. So besides the exercises in making a nice word and something that can be recognized and can be shown in small sizes, and all this endless list of requirements of a word and a typeface, there's also, in this case, it should have a meaning. Is it not contradicting at least what it's supposed to say? In Dutch, there is plaatje praatje, and that's often seen as an approach. You take an arbitrary shape and you put next to it an arbitrary name and then call that a logo. We always try to get away from that. That if you leave out one of the two, then you have less than half. So what's the relation between the two? That makes, and you can do that by putting the letter into an environment, or see how those what the interacting shape between such an image and the word is, or redefine the word, or and then there's this extended usage where an ad agency wants to add a payoff. So is the logo capable of doing that? Is it already part of it? Is it a system where the payoff can change over the years, where the logo itself remains the same level of visibility? And in this case, the assignment was pretty complex because there's a whole set of associations that are supported by the organization that traditionally have their own identity, but they should visually be part of it, but they have all kind of different names. So how can you make something? So in this case, the R, and you see the more or less, it's a moving R, italic, and that by itself was strong enough to make logo combinations more like a system. So you can add in every kind of word here and it will still fit. The typeface in this case was Profile by Martin Wenzel. And moving to another. So this is an older one, 22 years, still in use. Dutch Republic is a software company. An even longer name than the Römer Fonds, Römer Nederland. And there is this little twitch in it, which has the name in itself, because Holland, Netherlands are not a republic, they're a kingdom. So that's the more or less the joke in here. That's already, so you're going to emphasize that, or is it something to ignore, or to? So the same thing, and it even starts out with no particular typeface. So what is it if you take a marker and you write the word over and over and over again? What happens? And they're hidden surprises sometimes, and not always. And you can go on, and at some point say, well, this is how far we can get. Some words are harder to make logos for than others, but the same here. So what can you vary? Sketches are also documentation. If you do this in design, there's a lot of intermediate versions that never get to be seen. So then customer may have ideas that you already rejected, but it wasn't documented. So sketching takes more time, but at the end it creates a whole set of documentation that can be reused even years later, as an example in other identity presentations. About the sketching process itself, this is a sheet from my time at the academy, which was 75 to 80, where we got these sheets. The only way of making type was going to the print shop and do letterpress for whatever was available. And the other side was, well, then sketch it. And type specimens were hard to get. They're really expensive. But there were manufacturers like Monotype in this case, who brought out these sheets for designers where you see the sizes on the side, and there were no scanners, there were no computers. You couldn't have a photocopy machine, and then tracing paper. That was it. It's easier now, so even it's likely that an identity has not enough time to make a new typeface. So in practice, it means that you're doing a refit or a change of an existing typeface. So print the word in all the typefaces you can find your computer, lowercase and capitals, and then see what happens there. So they give a good tracing background to make drawings. I always say that it is not championship freestyle type drawing. In this case, it's not intended to be a new type design. It is to see what happens, maybe even with existing typefaces, because you always have to fit something with text, fitting it with an existing type. So even if you make something else, at least it should work together. The Dutch public, is it something to be used or not? So those things happen if you draw them, much more likely than typing them. But it costs time. It is the mantra of going through drawings. You cannot speed it up. It looks like you type this in different typefaces and print it, and then cut bits and pieces here, then you made a logo. That's not the kind of assignment we were seeking. There should be some time in finding, getting to know what happens there. And again, I said it before, drawing the white space often is a way of finding unique combinations, because they are part of the name, instead of just looking at the letters. Although type may be black and white, it is you're drawing the white space with your black shapes, and maybe the white space, maybe the counters in designing typeface are more important than the type itself. So any combinations, even if it gets unreadable, it may be a start point for someone else to get another idea that you never thought of. There's also vertical alignments that may be desirable or not. Sometimes it works nice. Sometimes it makes it really unreadable, especially in names that are abbreviations with an arbitrary order of capitals. Damaging the type also will reduce the recognition of the word, because there's no redundancy. If if a word like this, you can damage it more than if the logo is just ABC or so. And then there's counters in letters. So that ended up with the result here, where the counter of the R is also the D, and you can still look if the other way around also works, because the counter of the D is not an R, but maybe that's also something. In this case, that was the starting point to make the final logo. But once you're there is still the choice. Okay, and then how precisely? Is it? There's still many ways of doing it. So that's often what we call the second phase. You more or less know how to do it, but then still exactly how to do it and make the final drawings, that may be as much time. It's comparable to drawing the type and then spend as much time on the spacing as you did on the drawing. That also works in making the stationery and the visual language of other publications that are not necessarily containing the logo or have a reference. So what is it that you can borrow from that visual grammar that is in use in development, and then use it in other areas, so that becomes part of the recognition, even if they don't contain the full logo. This is all really old-fashioned, like 10, 20 years ago. This was really an issue, making stationery where the letterhead and the envelopes and the business card and the compliment cards all fit together, and they were printed, and they had all kind of requirements how they did in postal usage. Things changed, and so if you say 20 years ago, I'm a graphic designer, so I make stationery, you're in trouble, because then with no stationery, you're not a graphic designer anymore. If you say I make publications, and in the technology and the style of the format of the publications at that period in time, then you'll never run out of work. It's partly definition, it's also a mindset. But this was all stationary still at that time. You see the white is using the gray of the tracing paper. So if you put white at the back, it stands out. And also in this case, those white papers were printed, so you can make some kind of standard layout. You don't have to sketch the lines of text. It's not a championship line drawing. So once you can use the computer to make things faster or repeating stuff, why not do it? It's also not that the case that you do first sketch, and then on day X on Wednesday night, the sketching phase ends, and then the computer phase starts. That's often questions I get from students. When's the sketching stop? So, well, actually never, and especially not in the definition that you can throw everything away and start over. That's the sketching phase. And that includes hand drawing, and it includes computers back and forth all the time. You can do some in InDesign, and then decide that there's some things you want to work out, and then start sketching on paper again. That whole process is sketching. It's not something to do with the materials. All right, you see some other lucky coincidence that happens, that they are actually in this shape, resembles the map of Holland. It's some kind of, sometimes you get a present, and that if you present it to the customer, it looks like you have been working along this route all the time, but at some point it was just a lucky finding. This one is more recent. A friend of mine is directing directing the creative industries in Netherlands institution. So he had this idea of diversity, which was connected to this kind of sketches. Those sketches are easy to make, because you start an idea of what this could become a whole new typeface, but just with one letter. The problems start if you need to make the second letter that fits the first one. So although this looks very diverse, and it's kind of avoiding the difficult part of type design to make things the same, but it gives an overview of all the dimensions and all the diversity, which is very close to my brother Eric's type cooker. He made that for TypeMedia at first, but it's a good training tool for type designers, because it gives a recipe of making type that fits that doesn't fit a comfort zone. You have to go out and solve this recipe. You may never draw it yourself, but make a typeface that fits this. So all the letters on the right fit different. Besides that, there are figures, which is the construction requirement in the type cooker. Each of them probably needs a different recipe to describe them, but you get very close to those parameters of that I was talking about first. So that ended in a typeface with only 3 letters, but then with many versions, and then that's a very different way of designing type, because now you're doing the kerning of different typefaces, which almost never happens except in logos or so. And then there is this this JavaScript that creates a random version every second to emphasize the diversity of what the organization is doing. In a more formal way, that leads to variable spaces. So as you can see, that thinking in parameters of different type has been as old as type design and as typography exists. It's just that now making variable fonts, it has become part of the file format, which opens up a lot of possibilities. It also adds restrictions because you cannot do anything you like. It has to fit in the routine that the glyphs should interpolate, which is not always what you would like from a designer point of view. So you have to make a lot of workarounds. This chapter is about sketches in how to think in n-dimensional spaces. How can you use the axes of variable fonts to hide certain features in type? How can you misuse the original format into making it work for your design? One way of doing that is making 10-dimensional spaces more simple and put them in 3 dimensions, and then have those cubes in a row and call that a catalog axis. It's easier to, it helps making a variable font getting done within a lifetime if you incorporate that in the design process. So there's a lot of sketches how to make a multi-dimensional space, which is over 3 dimensions, into something that is at least something you can discuss about, and how can you test it, and how can you make sure that the space, that the whole space is more or less okay, that there aren't areas in the design space that you tell people don't go there because it doesn't look good. In my view, it's responsibility to the designer to make sure that whatever you do with a product, if it's an industrial product or a type, should not be dangerous. You can't say you should only use this car in this situation, because otherwise it will kill you. That probably will never get on the road. So these are sketches on how to make those design spaces visual. You talk about it to connect parameters with each other as a drawing, but probably also as an automated graph. Here's some others, how to sketch the area that's no go in the grade area. Probably is type that should not, that doesn't look nice. So how can you prevent the shapes molding into that? And there are ways of doing that, how to prevent it. At least not to make it really bad. So it's not just the type, it's also designing ways to present it. If you're designing a car and you don't design the test track along with it, or user appreciation surveys, then you can design whatever you want. But it's not, the designer is not the final vote in that. It's not art. So it's my preference, and that's also what I try students to become aware of, that you do the whole thing at the same time, not in a sequential way. You cannot design a testing method if you don't do it at the same time as making the design itself, and the other way around, it also doesn't work. So sketching, my sketchbooks, these are just samples of a whole stack of them. Try to constantly visualize ideas. Especially working in a team, you can have great ideas in your head, even if they're really great, but you never know unless they'll get on paper. But to get them on paper and show them to people, talk about it, verify, get feedback is one of the most important things. In my view, in getting through complex design processes. I'll come to the QA later, and I'll try to get this through this first. So trying to the 3 dimensions is doable. 4 is still a little bit doable, but sketching 10 dimensions, you end up in this kind of graphs, where the problem is that the distance between every 2 circles is the same if you measure that in those high dimensional spaces. So I've been looking into areas how to visualize that and to automate that. So these are some Python output from an existing design space file. You can also use code to read a variable font and then make this kind of animations from it. So it's not all the information is there and it's structured. So you can create programs that query existing fonts and then make graphs that show more what they are, what they contain. So the sketching part of infographics and then publications that contain those infographics in an automated way, because you don't want to do this manually. This is a very, very rudimentary website, variable designer.space. Don't expect anything if you go there, but you can see this thing. So the animations are based on d3.js, which is a JavaScript library that makes it possible to visualize networks, for instance, and you can grab them, you can manipulate them. It's a way of making multiple dimensions. Although on the other hand, if it really gets complex, as you'll see with the next one, it still is very difficult to see what happens. So this is a traditional 27 master design space flattened out into 2 dimensions. That typically is not something you want to visualize. You need to think of simplifying methods to show the differences, different stages and so on. But scripting, you can write code. You can also try to visualize it first and go back and forth. If you can't write it, if you can't draw it, why do you think that writing the code would help you? Trying all those capabilities at the same time. This is about sketches about solving the problem in vertical alignment. That is really a problem between Drawbot, InDesign, Sketch, and CSS. They all do it differently. So how can you make a system that understands vertical alignment and gives the opportunity to designers to choose? So this is the whole overview. You might want to have things aligned on baseline or cap height or descender or X height or half X height or half cap height. And they should be recognized. This is typically things that are missing, for instance, in InDesign, where you want to align top of a headline of a certain point size with the top of a photo, other than do it manually. If you want to automate that, you have to be able to recognize what the positions of those different locations in a typeface are. And those are not fixed values. Depending on the typeface, the position of the cap height and X height can be very different. So sketching, again, how do areas of your code in a library work together? What's the relation between classes? What are they capable of doing? How do they, is a page part of a document, or is it a document just referring to pages? And the pages have no idea from which document they are part of. Those are all decisions if you're writing code that is automating pages and everything down into typography and type. You need to decide how those objects and classes are organized. Testing algorithms. So if you want to know what the point size is for a given width, it's hard to predict. So what you can do is you just guess a point size and see how much of it is different, and then calculate it. Skipping through a lot. This is the digitizing in mid-80s. Earlier than that, sketching the algorithms. I did an internship at URW during my study, and the Icarus algorithm was secret, but I got it from Pinkarov as a present, as a reward for my intern, which was nice. But it's Fortran. It takes a while to understand what this does, going back and forth. At some point I figured it out, so that became Mac Icarus mid-80s. And understanding how Icarus curves work. This is a processing animation that shows how the five equations in Icarus trying to match up the position of two arcs with each other. It's, sketching, going back and forth with Gerrit Noordzij about algorithms. This is all even before PostScript, how are we going to draw letters in the future. But late 70s, there weren't even computers, so you have to build them yourself. With, in this case, a printed circuit board that could contain 1K of memory. So that is around 120 letters. Buying a hard drive for 5,000 guilders of 5 megabytes, early 80s, that's one photo. We have around 300 CDs and DVDs over the 40 years of the studio, but the first 10 years is on the first CD on board. So we have no idea how much that the speed and volume increased over the years. Half bidding by hand. So it's the pre-version of anti-aliasing, because at that time there was no gray scale. That later became more totally automated as we have it now. TROF, which is the typesetting ROF. This is still in your computer, and nobody knows that. But there's a total complete typesetting machine inside the terminal. If you go to your terminal, if you're Mac and you type manual GROF or TROF, you get this instruction how it works. There are no typesetters that are working with it, and at that time certainly not. So and there was no Unicode. So this was all arbitrary. Every typesetting foundry, typesetting machine manufacturer did it in a different way to figure it out the hard way. And drawing by hand. At that time there were no ways of printing it. This is painted, calculating the diameter of the circle, and then painted in or use markers. And now we have you can do this whole thing in 10 lines of code. It's unfair. And that goes on. So these are more recent ones. Sketching code. How would interpolation show up? What is useful? What is help if you are a designer? And things like algorithms to do automatic spacing and kerning. This is the algorithm that was used for upgrade. It does 80–90%, which is more or less the same as AIs are doing. So I'm still not sure if that how much of that will actually improve, but probably I'm wrong in the future. And a more recent one. So this is a spacing kerning tool, and within the tool range accessible in the Type Network. And that is giving feedback and live spacing kerning information, and you can see the groups how they combine. They switch from spacing to kerning, and I don't see that as a sequence. It is the white space between type is not knowing what part came from type from the kerning, what part came from the tracking, what part came from the letter margins. So it probably is better to do it all at the same time instead of spacing and then try to cover up all the mistakes in the spacing later on in the kerning phase. Book by a friend of mine. So he asked, can you do a typeface specifically for this? So it's a book, it's kind of a joke because there's no mountains in Holland. This is about the mountains for bikers or cycling. And of course there are none. Well, there's some small ones. And this is about how famous cyclists did their training. So this it started with a flat tire idea of the serif, and then that grew in a typeface with all kind of funny things, with the wheels and gears and of course it's insane to make a typeface for one design job, but if it's fun, it's worthwhile, and it's for a friend. Some other things, a really old one, part of my graduation project at the time, but it became a TypeMedia project. Funny thing of it is that you start with the base shape and you can change the parameters independently, and you can do much easier scripting on that because it's so much more structured than normal typefaces. You don't have to think about optical corrections and overshoot and that kind of things. So it started with manipulating individual parameters, individual pixels, and then the next, when variable fonts came around, you can think about what is a pixel capable of doing in a variable space. So these are studies of 1/4 pixels. So every shape that you see, you have to multiply by 4 and then rotate them to make a complete pixel. And how many points do you need? Because all the masters in a variable font need to interpolate. So the outlines need to contain the same amount of points, and they have to have the same function. But you can put them on top of each other to hide certain features in a certain part of the design space. So this was a study in itself, which I found way more complex than I thought it would be. So how many points do you need to to create a certain set of shapes, and how do you put that in a catalog? How they mold, they morph one shape into another? Is the shapes in between, are they still interesting? And what part of that shape do you want to exclude? Because in this case, because they are creating pixels that are used all over the letter, it doesn't really matter what kind of shape you use because it still becomes a letter. But at some point there's a limit because you can't recognize the shape anymore. So these are studies, ended up with 11 axes. And then there's a problem, how do you test that? Because 3 dimensions is already insane. 11 dimensions is testing. You end up in hundreds of thousands of combinations that are, you can never test them again. I love to take knowledge and skills from other areas. Simulated annealing is something that comes from industrial design and other testing settings, where you can't say, you can make a complete set of testing values, but by just randomly take positions in that space and see if that still is okay. And you take 1,000 testing points, and if they are okay, you can assume that every value in between is okay too. That's how cars are tested. You don't test every speed and every circumstances, but you like every temperature or so with 100th of a degree in between. You make some steps, and where you say we tested every 10 degrees and we tested every 10 kilometers an hour, and everything, if that works, we can interpolate, assume that everything in between also works. So that ends up in this kind of animations where there's a point making a path through random 11 dimensions, and then combine them. And anytime you do it again, it comes up with a new kind of fireworks. And so again, as I said before, designing the testing method along with the design is essential, especially if the design becomes more complex. And that can be a variable font of anything more than 5 dimensions, or it can be a corporate identity, or a complex user application. How do you know that you're done? When do you know that this is finished, that it fits the requirements of the original assignment? And the answer is you can't, but at some point you have to deliver. And so part of doing the assignment is designing an environment that you agree with your customer. If it fits those tests, then we consider the assignment to be finished. Otherwise, we try to update that. Some older ones, upgrades already out. You see the spacing tool, printing tool again here. But we're working on some new things, which also starts with sketching. But in this case, the sketching phase is way smaller because this is mostly production work, doing it either manually or script or combinations. Some of the scripts only run once, and then with the result, you make another period of work manually, and then have another script running, and so it's back and forth. The scripting itself is just as much part of the design process as the drawing part is. Another fun project, of course, this is not really commercially interesting, but it's really fun to do. So what's the boldest, blackest typeface you can make, and also be a slab serif, so you have no space for the stems anymore. This is another one which is almost done. This included, if you start from handwriting, which you could see is another form of sketching. It's quick, you can do it over again. So what is the transformation? And you can scan it and then trace it, and it often gets into horrible shapes. Or retrace it by making by drawing the hard line. This is more in the direction of Metafont, where we control the shape of and the size of the pen if it runs over this path, and then offer some tools to adjust the shapes and in exceptions. So where the round shapes go into stems, you can make them a little thinner, especially in the bold versions of this. So starting with handwriting as a sketch, and then transforming it into type. This is an example of the great tool by Joost van Rossum, the font goggles. You can see all the combinations live. Especially with handwriting, you have a lot of feature transformation, glyph replacement, depending on the connectors, the combinations of the type together. An whole other area this is what used to be called icon design, let's say 20 years ago. Nowadays it would be called emoji design. The name changed. For the rest, things didn't change so much, except that we didn't have Unicodes for them at the time. But a lot of the visual grammar comes back here. It's always balanced between coherency and diversity. How much of the icons, how much of it should be the same as with type, to make sure that they belong visually to the same style, and still you need to recognize that they're different and they have a meaning. Problem with icons is that it differs very much if there is a name, a tag, a label with it, explaining what it is about, or you just have to get the meaning from the icon itself. And it's much harder than people think to get this right. Especially it has to be cross-culture, cross country, cross environment, interests, age groups, to make sure that everybody understands this and all the same idea, that this is the same word, has the same meaning. It didn't. That didn't change. Some emojis you might still recognize, but most of them are, you really have to learn them and agree what their meaning is. And probably 10 years from now, they have a different meaning. So we've over the years, we've been doing a lot of these for applications or for signing systems, or so it has become a whole stack. Sometimes the resolution doesn't matter if this has become going part of a signing system where you have to make symbols and arrows. The resolution is not a problem. Maybe even the ratio is not a problem. If they become part of the top icon in your browser URL, you only have 16 pixels square. You have color and anti-aliasing, but it's still hard to make something that's recognizable. And it's also dangerous. Like, this was a nice idea at first, but then I discovered this week that we already did the COVID-19 icon like 20 years ago. Meaning totally difference of changes when the world changes. Different handwritings, different techniques, depends also on what the resolution is. So if it is going to be 16 square or 32 square, then better start with a thick pencil, not to get lured into adding more, a lot of details, because they cannot be drawings, they have to be symbols. Another one, and if it's just illustrations, then you have a lot more freedom, especially when the tag. But it's still hard. Like, even if they are symbols, arrows, everybody understands, and question marks. But if it gets a little bit more, like you have 9 pixels to visualize different kind of diseases or so, that would be totally impossible. Same for infographics. So it's similar, but it's the wider range of it, where you try to make a visual language which becomes a system. If you see multiple infographics, you understand the consistency in meaning, how certain symbols are reused, and then also design where the variations is. What can be different between one infographic and another, and maybe with some years in between. How can you this, for instance, this was the metaphor for testing water quality in different areas of the country, and you put them in a database, and you see that sequence going from left to right. And we worked on this with several designers, making visuals and illustrations, animations. It was for the computer department of the state department for traffic and environment and water quality and that kind of things. And then another level, like designing the corporate manual, is a design job by itself. Where the infographics are suddenly used to explain people how the corporate identity works. It's not. It's a testing track of a corporate identity. If you cannot make a manual from it, explaining to people how it works, how do you think that people can use it later? So that might be also a starting point. Doing it right away at the same time as the corporate identity is made. Why not make the identity of the manual that describes it at the same moment? And anything that has to go into a group, is based on this this set of what level of diversity, what level of coherency should there be? So what parameters are you using for what and what for the other? Going the other way. A quick one. For years, we designed all the forms for ING Bank and Machine Nederlander, which is heavily grid-based. At that time, they had 8,000 different forms in stock, printed material, that had to be designed. So we made a grid system with a ruler like this, and then do a lot of sketching on different types of forms and stationery. How they and is the orange already pre-printed? Then that cannot be part of the changing layout. So then you're stuck with the logo, for instance. But if the orange can be printed, then you have much more freedom. These are sketched. At this time, doing this digital was not really an advantage. I think nowadays we would start with a much more quicker overview of sketching and then pretty quickly go into coding, except that this whole range of forms no longer exists in physical form. This is all has become HTML and CSS, which is a very different path of design, but at the end, it's still design. So you end up with UX and UI design doing the same thing. So making typographic grid decisions still is worthwhile to spend some time doing it like this. This is a pet project of mine, pretty old. This document is 12 years old, but the idea is much older. So how do you transform automatic page layout into algorithms? And in the beginning, it's easy, like just columns. But this document was more like a testing, it's a benchmark. So it is about automatic page layout, but it is also a complex piece of page layout containing content and illustrations that can be combined and can you make software? I'm still not here. This is still part of the ongoing PagePop project to add in intelligence that understands how different typographic components and illustration components fit together and compose a page, especially if they have different sizes. So you have this rolled up piece of text is called a galley in old-fashioned printmaking, and you cut them and then paste them on the page like just a long run of an article, and you paste them into different columns in film to make a page. This is all pre-digital page layout, but the problem didn't move away. It's just that we more rely on doing it manually in InDesign. But if you want to automate, it's really complex because you have to fit all this. When a headline should go with the text to the next page, although it still fits on the previous page. What do you do with footnotes, and what do you do with a table that's sticking out of the column and it doesn't fit in the next column? And then you have to go to kind of negotiate between the columns, and software can do that, but it's not a simple thing to, and it's also not something that you can easily solve with artificial intelligence. It needs extra information in how to manipulate this kind of situations and what to do next, designer decisions. A recent project, design education, Xijing Zhang, one former student, organized a trip to Shanghai to make an exhibition in 10 days about design, about type design, and where the whole process of making the exhibition was a design project in itself, with sketching, programming. When Claudia and I both stopped teaching more half-time 3-4 years ago, we decided to start our new school. It's not a masterclass because we don't have accreditation on master, but it is a master. It's a study on master level, but it can be any length of time. We recently published a new curriculum for the year, starting at 24th of August, from memory. in a variety of different targets. Almost everything that you have seen in this presentation is fitting in one of those workshops. This is a publication we made last year for the Typographics goodie bag. Small assignments, keep it small. You can't do the assignment in an hour. Why do you think you can do it in 3 months? That idea. If the architect can only build the whole house for you and not capable of making a sketch or a small model, why would you trust this architect? So making things small and then see if that works and extend from that. So the model in my back is only 10 centimeters high, and it just works just as well as a visual sketch than drawing the whole, building the whole exhibition in real size and then rejecting it. Some covers of the different workshops. You can check them out if you want. So getting back here, sketching is not your sketchbook. That's a medium. The sketching is what you do to visualize for yourself, but especially also for others, people in your team, people that you give an assignment, customers, audience, and what your ideas are, and then get feedback as quick as you can, and then say the next hour, and then do it again and start from scratch if necessary. And so design is a process. It's also learning to play a music instrument and to write a story and to raise children and to anything that needs training and developing skills is something that gets better if you do it again. That's not me. That's a whole list of people, including people that are not on this list, that over the years worked in or for or together in the studio. So many of the things that you saw is their hand. It's not my hand of illustrations, but it's us. So my wife and me, partners in any way. And that was it. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you're still there, and I hope it was interesting. Let's see if there are any questions. There's a bunch of questions here. Does it make a difference whether or not you sketch using a pen or pencil or stylus and iPad? Of course, there's a difference, but it may not be an important difference because the difference may be compensated by the advantages. I do both. I find myself still preferring, but that may be the age or being old-fashioned, in having a sketchbook with me. It's also the escape if my laptop runs out of power. I still have my sketchbook, which never runs out of power. But anything you can see from Eric online that he's posting, that's all stylus and iPad. It's a preference, and it may change from one project to another. The advantage of doing it on an iPad is that it's immediately digital, and you can go back and forth. I know he has a way of sketching type and then pasting that directly into rubber font, and then seeing the difference with the original outline immediately, which you would never do with when it's pencil and paper. But there's other ways. I have a Moleskine where I've removed the wires, and so you have separate sheets, and you can easily sketch and feed them through a tabletop scanner, and then say 5 seconds I have it as a background. So there are differences, I like the sequence that I keep all the originals, so I can go back in time. If you do it with a stylus, you kind of lose the originals all the time. It's more a sequential way of working. testing user space. Okay, that's what I call the simulated annealing. You can look it up. There's a nice Wikipedia page about it. It's a well-known method in industrial design where you say, let's say you have a three axes in I'm not sure if that's a question, but if you have a three-dimensional design space, you randomly generate 1,000 points in that space, and you see if that still works. The randomness makes that those points are evenly distributed on the space, so their distance is more or less the same. And then if the density is enough, you have to figure that out. If there can be errors that you overlook with the distance, because you want to have as low amount of points to test, but they should be high enough not to overlook pockets of errors that can be in that space. And then look through that list, and then assume that if they are okay, you assume that everything in between that space is also okay. To emphasize on the difference between the user space and the design space, there are areas in the design space that may not be really nice if they extrapolate, for instance. How can you convince users not to go there? At least you can warn them and put signs up, don't go in this area. I personally believe more in making it safe for people to go there, so there's not much damage. They can, maybe not all the type is really great, but it's still okay. I'm not sure if that's the same question. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but know more about the non-linear interpolation between the sketching design spaces part of the presentation. Okay, so it's a bit hard to do it not as a drawing, but I try to describe it. If you think about the original Skia made by Dave Burlow and Matthew Carter, it has a queue, and that queue jumps the diagonal in and out at a certain point. That's done by putting two masters really close together, so close that there is hardly any space in between. They cannot have the same coordinate, but they can really close to each other. That means that you can make one cube here, another cube there, and they're kind of vacuum connected. Every master has to interpolate, but they may jump from function. So you can have a serif that suddenly disappears instead of going shorter and shorter, ending up with something that doesn't look so nice. Let's see, I hope that answered the question. Learning type, that's a big one. Can you have literature how to play a musical instrument? But there are some, our background, people who graduated in The Hague are started with Gerrit Noordzeij's model of contrast. So my very biased advice is read Stroke of the Pen by Gerrit Noordzij and start writing with different pencils and see what the contrast is doing, where parts of the letters are thick and thin. That directly comes from the chosen material, and that helps you a lot. But it's a big question. It depends what you want to achieve. You want to learn something about type, or you want to become a type designer. Those are really two different sides of the same spectrum. What's the truth about proposed to develop a custom typeface behind an editorial project? If it increases the cost, and it's probably not something to the designing a typeface is in many cases the magnitude of what a decent corporate identity would cost to make. So many times people wouldn't have the budget to do that. Sure. Yeah, the practice is that find an existing typeface that does most of the work on typographic level, so body text and headlines in a corporate magazine and a website, and then see how that type could be adjusted, or decide that the typeface for the logo has nothing to do with the main typeface, but they are easily living together on the same page, but they don't have to refer to each other. That's a choice. So is the typeface of the main text part of the recognition, or do you say, okay, but I just use Verdana on screen and that's good enough. I don't have to have any recognition from the body text. You do that by having a certain kind of photographs and a color in combination with the logo. That by itself is a choice. What kind of parameters are going to be used for the diversity and the coherency of the. How long does visual identity last for? Do you keep this in mind when designing? Yes, of course. That is very dependent on what the customer wants. If it's an identity for a music festival that only runs for the next 5 weeks and then it totally ends, that is a very different thing than making something that is a multinational where every publication will last for years. Having said that, it totally changed over the years because 20 years ago it was really an investment to print 15,000 copies of a brochure, and that they would use for the next 5 years. Nowadays, branding has scaled down to a logo on Facebook, for instance. If the company decides not to have any publications at all and just have Facebook pages, and you have to have a logo for the Facebook profile, you can change the identity every day. So it depends. It depends what is necessary, and that, of course, totally transfers into the budget and the time that's available, and also how many people are going to use, how many people are there using it. If you design the identity and for the next 5 years you'll be the only one making publications, it's a very different thing than making corporate manual and send it out to all the world's ad agencies that have to work with it. That means a different kind of complexity and different, and also how local and how global should the meaning of the identity be, for instance. That can be very different. So the answer is it totally depends. It can be a couple of days from decades. Developing drawing skills. As a graphic design instructor for teens, what are your feelings about the importance of developing drawing skills? I think you can expect that my answer is totally biased there. I don't think you can do without it. It's like, how can you be a writer without being able to write? To visualize mental images and mental structures into something that you can talk about with other people. I cannot imagine any situation where that is not important. So even if you're not becoming a graphic designer, but let's say you're becoming a dentist and you're trying to sketch out what you're going to do to discuss that with a colleague, and it's just verbal, and that's hard. People make sketches, little diagrams or to visualize their ideas, and totally trust on words is, and I can refer you to my previous lecture in the Lubalin Center, which was called Words. The words have so many meanings and are so kind of lazy that you can hardly be sure that people understand the same from it. So opposing drawing skills by, okay, then just do it by words. I would say that a lot of problems in my idea in the world is because people try to fit things in words and then forget how to define the meaning. If you make little diagrams of ideas, that is much more, and still can add words and a story to it, much more telling than just a story about it. How much time do you spend in a project for sketching? It also depends. But overall, I would say that in the past, if compared to 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that is some of the bigger sketching sequences that you saw. Those are corporate identity sketches that we made. There was nothing else. So let's say maybe 70–80% of the project was sketching at that time. And then once we knew, then because there's no way to digitizing was hard. Photo lithography was really hard. That's not something you did yourself. So by the time that if there's no Photoshop, you have to give it to someone, and they start to make costs. So you better can know already what you want before you hire someone to do the production work. And that totally changed. So in the totally the opposite of a sketching for a typeface, maybe the sketching could be 2 days, and then the working around and the coding is maybe a year. So that totally reversed. But on the other hand, I have to say that it is not something I want to distinguish really between it, because sketching, we're back to the old-fashioned sketching, drawing in a notebook. That sketching part maybe have been reduced a lot with digital equipment and application become so available. But in my definition in this lecture, we say sketching is anything that I can throw away totally and start over. That also includes a digital part. And then the ratio is kind of what it was. Part of what we do, for instance, in spacing type, you can spend months on spacing and kerning. But if you take this part of that time in writing scripts that do 80–90% automatic, then writing the script, in my definition, is a sketching phase, and then running it is only a couple of minutes. So if you agree that writing the script itself is a sketching part of the design process, and then suddenly 95% of the work is sketching again. But again, it differs from one assignment to another. Yeah, I think I answered that. Design typefaces, I would start with Gerd Noordzij's Struggle of the Pen. My preference in books that show how to do it is more people that show me the material and the processes, and not so much examples in how to do it, because those already exist. And maybe it's in the interest of becoming a professional that it's easier to start with the process, because it's almost a guarantee that something else comes out at the end. Publish as a book, I'm not sure if that will happen. We are in the process of making more and more study material available on the design.space website. If you have specific questions, contact me and we always can discuss that. If you go to the website, you'll see that there is there's a list of assignments that we give to students, or that they either can do with our help or they can do it themselves. And we try to add visual material there. On the other hand, I'm a little bit hesitant there, because giving away the sketches is like they easily become examples, and I prefer people to think for themselves in how to do it, with some predefined models in how they can continue working, instead of trying to do the same thing that we already did. Because most of the sketches that you saw were for problems that don't exist anymore. The end product was what is the example of a 10-dimensional design space, and what was the end product? Well, the thing that you saw there, the animations of the TYPETR, the fireworks, those are the results from a program cycling through an 11-dimensional design space in a random path. In reality, I didn't mention that, but part of the designing a design space is that you only can survive that by making it more simple, by simplifying. And one way of doing it is putting a hierarchy on the axes. So width and weight probably have much more impact than the rounding of a serif. So if you start with rounding of a serif, you end with a really complex thing where everything depends on each other. If you say you solve the big ones first and then make the rounding of the serif independent from the weight, for instance, that brings some design limitations, but that scales down an exponential growth in work into a linear growth in work. But it's anything, any parameter that you can think of could be an axis. And if you do it the wrong way, everything influences everything else, and you end up doing the whole lifetime on one type design. What inspires me, there is a list. We can find a way of publishing that. They are mostly non-designers. They are mathematicians and scientists and educators. I'm in general more interested in how people are doing things and what kind of other, like the simulated annealing is not something you'll find a lot in graphic design, but it's a well-known method of testing in industrial design. I also did, beside my academy or after the academy, I did 6 years of studying industrial design here in Delft at Technical University. That helps me a lot in thinking in processes, although I'm not into lamps and banks and chairs design. If you go one step further, there's so much generic in design that you can reuse over and over again in other areas. Yeah, there is a list. I have a list of recommended videos. I certainly advise my students to watch that. So I'll compose that together and we find a way of sharing that. How much do you usually end up scripting and automating, or how much is there of handwork for you? The easiest way to answer that is that I don't make the distinction, and it is alternating. I can make a sketch of literally 10 minutes, and then write 5 lines of code in Drawbot and see if that worked, and then decide that was not a good approach, and then 20 minutes later back to sketching again on paper, making visuals, and I doodle while I'm coding. I describe the shape it should become in my code before I write the code. And sometimes I'm looking for an image and I can't find it in my sketchbooks, and I totally forgot it it is a piece of program. And in my thinking, there is not much difference. I look at code and I see the image, and not so much in. It would be the same as asking a musician, do you listen to music reading through music on paper, or do you listen to music from a CD? And I can't remember. It's actually the same thing. It's just different input that generates the same kind of imaging. And so it's not one or the other. They are alternating and pretty quickly in a process. So there could be like 10 minutes of drawing and then 20 minutes of programming, or the other way around, and going back and forth in a day like that is getting you through ideas and structures. It's almost like, if you need to test a page or using Illustrator or InDesign, it depends. It's for a lot of things, it doesn't really matter if you do it one way or another. It's the mental process that is behind it that matters. I think you are good in sketching. I don't think anybody is not good in sketching. You may not be experienced, but that's something else. The problem that people think is that sketching is a form of art, and they have to become images that your family members want to have, and they frame them and they put them on the wall. That's what sketching is. At the end, that becomes, if you do it a lot of times, then you get this automatic way of visualizing things. But there is no good or bad level in sketching. The only thing is that it may work or it may not work. But what do you want to do with it? And to get something out of your head into a visualized shape, even if it's only for yourself, and then throw it away immediately and then do it again, is a way of conversation that helps thinking. Thinking itself is a pretty slow process, but once you put it on paper and into something that visualizes it, it gives a lot of feedback. Is it something that can be visualized at all? So it's not dependent on how good at sketching you are. So just start with it. Anybody can run, but not all people can do world records. But that is not the only purpose of running. So what I would recommend, well, just start. Make your private sketchbook. Don't show it to anybody, and try to make one sketch every day. Fill one page with things that you see in the paper, or things that you dreamt about, or things that you think are interesting, and you write little stories next to it. And you keep track of a little bit of a layout by keeping margins so it looks like a book page. They're mostly tricks. If you're a really bad sketcher, you think, and you do that in a Moleskine book, and you force yourself just to use a black pencil, so you can't, you have to do it. There's no way to reverse it. The only thing keep in mind is maintaining a certain margin around it. It certainly starts to look like a book page. And just do it for yourself for a while. Yeah, there have been several versions of Gerrit's Cube into a variable font. It's only one glyph. It's only ease with 8 different masters. So that's how they interpolate. I did some early versions in when it was a multiple master still. I think others have done that. Not sure Eric did it. I think he did. He made a cube out of materials for the show at the TypeMedia. It was published as a photo in Roger Black's Type 3 magazine as an example. I think that was. I'm not sure if it was a variable font, but at least it was interpolated from 8 masters. The current fonts that I like, yeah, well, it's also a really biased answer, of course, my own. but especially the ones that I didn't make yet. It's a hate-love. So the ones I appreciate most is the sketches I made of the typefaces that I didn't make yet. But they're also my enemies, because some of them will escape the time that I have. Because it's much easier to sketch the infinite world than actually finish them. We used to do a lot of corporate design. Then it was difficult to make type, and especially within the area of with the time frame of the identity, or it was really specialized. So for the ING Bank, we made a special version of Times Roman. It's not something I want to show. I'm really proud of. It was just technical. But also the different versions of the ING Lion, making it work on different printer resolutions. But those are really technical, but at that time there wasn't so much opportunity to make a typeface work within the time span of an identity. That's different now. Maybe the typeface doesn't need to be complete, but that shifted. So we're not doing so much corporate design right now in the past 10 years. That shifted a bit, international and big studios. And also I've put my focus more on teaching and type. So that made the opportunity to do typefaces that I like to do, which are not there yet. And of course I like type that other people do, but then I'm jealous that I didn't do them. Yeah, it's a good question. So you've mentioned the Breton's visual variables. Is there any principle of variables for the more dynamic interactive medium? I did some sort of a thesis on that years ago. If you look up Jacques Breton, he's almost in any publication about interaction design, he is one of the first in the list of referred literature because of the B. But it's always that people have something to be added. So you see a lot of authors adding an 8th parameter that say he forgot something. And many of them say that time is something that he was missing. But if you read his books, then he says time should not be there. So he's very deliberate in that that's not a parameter. And the funny thing is that all 7 have already an existence in time. It's just that Jacques Breton traditionally, he passed away a couple of years ago. Traditionally came from old-fashioned printing versions of graphs, and then time and movement doesn't matter. But if you look at all the 7 of them, they have a time version of it. So position, the time version of position is movement. The time of the angle. The time version of angle is rotation. The time version of color is a spectrum, and etc. So it's instead of having an additional one to the 7, it works better, in my experience, to make another 7 that are related to movement or to time. It's not necessarily movement. And then like shape goes into morphing. And what's the other one? Texture, for instance, you can go into Marais to visualize the differences. And that, looking at it from that point of view, they're still valuable because you can dynamics and change in time and interaction is more like changing one of those 7 parameters or a combination of them in time. And so if your mouse goes over the hover of a link and it changes color, then that color is the parameter. It's not necessarily that the movement or the hovering itself is another parameter. It just influences the existing parameter. Sketches you can afford to throw away. Do you actually do that? Yeah, we do that when they are really, really, really horrible. In practice, we have the archive that we have of sketches is everything that we didn't print. So there's a digital archive, which still there's a lot of files I can't read anymore. But they are also, it's not that we keep them for nostalgic reason, or but they actually functioned. As I showed the whole set of pictograms and icons, you can imagine if you have an icon assignment 5 years later that also needs save and save as and file and arrows, and then you just look up in the folder previous projects doing icons, because many of them probably were already drawn. So they were also a live archive where you can take some research, especially if it's about user interaction, or it's a typography, or what you can do with a typeface, the things that are independent from a corporate brand. You can easily add them into the presentation and use them for customers, and it looks like you did a lot of work, but it's actually reusing. It's the physical way of copy pasting. So it's more than an archive. It was for years it has been an ID space. What did we do before? And many of those ideas never get produced, but they might be a good idea for another assignment. And nobody, it's like you're copy pasting from yourself, so who cares? But in practice, we saved most of them. You could set instructions so the nodes follow a nonlinear path. Yeah, that's a good question. So we ran into that. So we made the different weights that are in responder are grade outlines calculated around the hardline, but they don't interpolate so well, because indeed you would need Underware's high order interpolation to get curved paths of interpolation to make sure that especially when endings of stems rotate, that doesn't work so well in linear interpolation. So that makes responder not be a real good candidate in variable font. But in our case, when we interpolate the hardline and then calculate the outline again around it, that works pretty well. So it's a more indirect way of interpolation, where the hardline is interpolated. You want to show something, Carla? I can't read that. Okay. Okay, I can go on. Thank you. Let's see. From the examples you're showing, there was a lot of time invested to explore many different approaches. Do you find that you can still do that, or the work has to be completed faster? Yeah, the design cycle has increased, and the age of identities has decreased. That's part of the reason why we stopped to do corporate identities around 10 years ago. What I like to do the whole thing, and it went more and more into logo placeholders for Facebook, and you're also competing with the rest of the world. So and that's the whole industry has that problem, where in the past you could charge $5,000 for a website, and now You have to compete with 100 WordPress templates for $79. That's hardly competition, and that is an overall thing. Prices for design has become market prices and not the amount of hours that you spend on it. People expect to pay a certain amount for font if they pay at all, because they also are tempted to use open source design. But they look at a style. They don't look in, hey, this style has 800 glyphs and that one has 2000 glyphs, and one is hinted and has so many features. That's something that's more like a surprise at the end, once people took the license, and then before they do, they're comparing. So adding that all up, there is less and less time. The other hand, you can do more in less time. Compared to 20, 30 years ago, there was only sketching like this on paper and going back and forth. So making a big logo or a logo for a large hospital, or you could easily spend weeks and weeks and going back and forth with 3-4 presentations with the board of directors. And there was pre-internet. Now they already downloaded 12 different versions from a website, and they have to make something like this, but then better. That changed a lot. And on the other hand, the problem is still the same. People cannot do it themselves. We still look at this with the same eyes. It's just a lot of people are seeing so much more every day. That they can compare you with, you draw something and then 5 minutes later they compared it to something at the other side of the world that it looks like this. And in the past you would have said, yeah, who cares, because that's not where you will sell your product. That changed. I think it is that's you can complain about it, but it's part of the changing world. It's the same as the traditional typographers complained about that letterpress quality was lost when going to photo typesetting. You say, okay, you can complain about it 3 times and then move on, and that the world is not going to wait for you. So maintaining your position as or getting your position as a designer, professional designer, means that part of the work is finding ways to keep up with it, to stay ahead. And it's my experience that the one thing that is really difficult to increase speed of is acquiring skills. You can't, internet doesn't make you a faster learner to play violin. You can play the same piece of music from internet, but everybody can do that. But someone has to do that. Sure, you can make an AI being trained to do a lot of these things automatic that otherwise would have required designers. But who's going to make the training material for that artificial intelligence training? At some point, you still need designers. And you still need people. The same thing Google has, where the automatic translation gets worse and worse because the input is more and more automatic translated texts. So it's kind of an inbreed. If you have artificial intelligence that is trained by material that's made by other artificial intelligence, which will be very soon, that's not the danger, in my view, to graphic design. It is educating customers that if sure they can buy something, and I tell them if you can buy it, then buy it. You don't need me. And then they say, yeah, but it's so boring. So okay, then you need me. But that's a different price. So yes, it has to be completed faster, but it's also giving a lot of opportunities to be different once you get that skill being trained, because there's so many other people who don't do it, because there they go for very tempted easy solutions. Could you give some suggestions improvement for design systems in UI design field? Sure. keeping a practical, healthy balance between the slow process of sketching and the fast processing of using existing libraries. So if you can do a fantastic website downloading a WordPress document and then using that and then change the color and say I made a website. That is the easiest way, but it is also the way that it's hardest to distinguish yourself from anybody else who's doing the same thing. Because if it's easier, then everybody can do it. Students complaining that things are so difficult, say, well, you're on the right track, because that's where your profession will be. So the suggestion for improvement design systems in UI design is different angles. The reading didn't change so much. Pages being rectangular, containing text and images, even if they're responsive and they're moving and they are conditional, still are pages. So if you can't sketch a page in different variations, why is that going to work if you ask a programmer to make it? Look at other disciplines. That can be in history, it can be in magazine making, it can be in another angle is invest in understanding the coding. Even if you're not going to be a programmer or developer yourself, but totally understanding how that works, instead of making sketches in Sketcher and Photoshop and then hand it over to a programmer and they have to reinvent the whole system again because they just see pixels. But if the designer already makes something like a working model in code that is totally wrong programmed, but it works, and then give it to someone and say, oh, okay, now I understand what you do. Okay, let me rewrite it. And then that's a better method. So investing in overlapping skills with the people who are neighboring in the process and are further down the road in the process, it always pays back than just developing an image and throw it over the fence somewhere. I always give this example. If you're in a committee deciding to hire a new director, and there's one who can say I wave this stick and I get music, and another say I can play, in principle I can play every instrument, kind of. Not as good as the professional musicians, but I know that you get another discussion there. So if you are a graphic designer and you do a UI design course, even halfway or even with twice the time, and then that it always pays back. What are your two favorite books on typography principles? Yeah, questions. They are probably code-based, and they're not so much about typography itself. There are good books. I don't do them from memory. I can compose a list, but most of the books that I know about design and also type design and typography give you examples in what people do, and maybe that could be interesting. It also, but on a professional level, it may not be the most interesting thing. So adjacent to books on typography, I would say, okay, you can also read books about coding in the CSS and HTML, and books about type design that would give the bricks on how to make architecture, typography in this sense. And they are specialized. There are some good books about grids, for instance. The problem with books about typography, most of them are outdated. I have maybe 80% of the books on my shelves are no longer relevant. even including digital, where say, read a book about CSS3 and then CSS4 comes out and you can start from scratch. Personally, what helps me personally more is reading books about processes, about how design processes works. Then this is how good typography works. That's not a really fitting answer, I know that, but the difference is exactly what I try to say. That is, it's not examples that you're after. It's because they are outdated next year when new browsers come out and when new typefaces come out. But it is how do you get there? Improving drawing skills. Do it, and do it again, and do it again, and do it again. And that's a boring thing. It's how you run marathons. Just do it much often. The challenge is there to get yourself in some small areas. Like running a marathon is just adding pieces of 100 meters and then do it again, not looking at the 42 kilometers at the same time. So acquiring drawing skills is a long path that may be too long to be nice. But if you break it into pieces that are nice by themselves, you'll end up at some point. So one of the assignments that I give students to do this, some kind of duration training, is that you buy yourself a new moleskin, you buy yourself a nice new pencil, and you visualize, you take some article in a newspaper or magazine that is really complex to look at with a lot of data and so on. And then you imagine the assignment that you have to visualize one of those infographics again. And then do that and give yourself half an hour, and do that one page. And then the next day do it again, and next day do it again. And then make sure that the whole, what is it, 150 pages is filled in 3 weeks, 4 weeks. And then you find yourself not doing the discipline because you've only got halfway. Shit. But that is already a lot of drawings. And doing it. And then and the more you do it, and if you get over the shyness of showing it to other people, or you or just some friends that maybe that can say, they dare to say more than, hey, I like your work, but give some based feedback. Make 3, 4, 5 drawings and then discuss with someone and then try to do it again. It is any skill. So developing skills is equivalent of the sketching process and design process. The more you do it, it gets better. And the trick is to get yourself in a position that it's nice doing it. And then you find yourself doing it all the time. If it doesn't work, find another way of doing it. But yeah, something that stimulates to do it over and over and over again, and then get some feedback at some points to like you can do a lot of running every night, but if you do it in a club, there is a coach who say, hey, if you do it this way, it gets better more quickly. Do you think the use of computer helped graphic design or took away some of the crafts? It certainly took away crafts, but that may not be the same thing as graphic design. So if design, again, is doing things again and it gets better, and then in a graphic context, that didn't change if you do it manually or in letterpress or in medieval handwriting or in sketching. The act of making something graphic that is visualizing an idea or a text, that didn't change. The craft certainly changed. There's a lot of if you worked in a print shop 20 years ago, most of this knowledge is totally useless nowadays. And the same way that if you are good in doing websites and you lived 30 years ago, you would be crucified, because you're doing things that people don't need. So a lot of the crafts, there are still saddle makers around, and there are people who can really good at that. It's just that the public and the volume is totally different than as it was. So if you're running a hot metal print shop or a letterpress archive, then that is great to have that craft there. If you expect assignments that will pay for a living, that's unlikely. But both of them are graphic design. So in that sense, I'm not sure if it's taken away or it is added to it. It's more like an emphasis. And things get more and more important at a certain area in time with certain technology. But with the aim of what graphic design is trying to do, visualizing ideas and text to other people, I'm not sure if that really changed. Do you have any predictions for this decade type trends? Yes, but I'm not going to tell you. I don't know. It is. If you look at the volume, people are nostalgically saying how good letterpress was and how good graphic design was 20 years ago before the web, and do you like books or websites, that kind of questions. I think that things get more digital. I think we are just starting to discover what you can do with variable fonts. On the other hand, variable fonts, it's just a storage capacity. It's not, variable fonts did not invent interpolation or did not invent parameters. That was there a long time. Like EOW, Peter Carr was interpolating fonts in 76 already in Icarus. That didn't change. What changed is that suddenly it becomes available inside phones, and you can interact with it. The phone can interact and see what is available inside the variable font. That is different, because nowadays it's a very short loop in building the design into tools that your phone is capable of using. That's different than a designer making their own interpolations and selling them in separate fonts. So the technology will certainly guide into a direction that we have no idea about. We're still discovering what is the future of stereo music if only mono exists, and then we get stereo and people have no idea. So the first years you see stereo music going all the way from left to right within one song to show that it's really stereo. And that faded out a couple of years later, and now we don't. It's just there. It has to be there. We can't miss it, but it's not important anymore. So the prediction is technology becomes so important that we don't have to think about it anymore, and then we have time to do new stuff. And what is that? I don't know that. Would you recommend using iPad for sketching? That's already an answer above. The short answer is it totally depends what you want to do. iPad runs out of power. Moleskine books don't. On the other hand, if you need it digital right away, then it is easier to have it to sketch digitally. You can go back and forth between another application. And for the rest, it is preference. What do you like? Do you like the physical behavior, which I find myself still having a preference, having a booklet with me that I can, if I'm waiting somewhere, I don't have to unpack electronics, just to visualize ideas. But my brother Eric is totally in favor of sketching on iPad. Should we practice sketching type or objects first? Not sure what you think by objects. Maybe type is objects. You can have a house and a letter on the side, and what is that? There's a good phrasing by Jared Unger. It says, type are things and not pictures of things. That I think would, I would not make this distinction between them. Things that you can have objects that look like letters. I lost my. And objects are maybe three-dimensional versions or two-dimensional projects of projection of three-dimensional objects, but maybe there are images by themselves. And in general, any question where you say, should I do first something this or first something that? You say, yes, do it all together. And if you don't manage, then take a 5-minute break and then do first one and then the other, and then do it again. So the order doesn't matter. If the order matters, then you already know a lot. You have already done a lot of study. Can you share some important keys advice to sustainable design practice? As I said before, I think that the process is the most sustainable thing that you can do, and in supporting that is the learning skills, and the more skills and the more widely spectrum they span, the more independent you are. So if you know about coding in relation to typography, that is probably more sustainable than knowing CSS3 in relation to the current version of the Windows supported fonts. So the smaller your skills are, the more vulnerable it is for changes in the future. So getting skills, and then what also helps is training skills that are have a wide range. So if you know everything about infographics, illustrations, and you know almost enough about type to be a professional type designer, and you know how to code websites, you fit in almost any organization. Partly because you show that you can learn all those 3 things, but you also can interpolate between all the skills and managing almost everything that you can do in the future. When we hired people for the studio, we always ask, okay, what are your hobbies? What other things? And then people who can who are really good typographers, but they also play 3 musical instruments. They are much more interesting than people say, I just do pages, because they can bridge pages to music, and they see parallels in process. Meant about publishing it to understand better your way of thinking and archiving your effort, and rather than copying it. Okay, sure. The commercial advice is during the workshops in Design Space, we use a lot of material that I show people, much more than I could do in this amount of time here. I'm not against publishing it in public. It's more the time it takes to do that and to maintain it. So I try to limit it to people that are students. But if you send me a mail and specific questions, I'll always answer them. But to answer the question, we don't have a book, or there are many people who said we should, and then I say, yeah, but then it's a lot of work, and I'm normally more interested in making new stuff than archiving what we already did. And understanding is more in, not making an ad into this, but getting feedback on your own work often helps better than trying to understand how other people did it. Learning a musical instrument, playing yourself, is much more rewarding, learning it, than looking at people playing musical instruments. No matter how nice it can be, it is not a way of learning how to play. And so do it yourself and get feedback on it. That is with Google developing large library of free fonts. They're not free. You don't have to pay for them. That's another thing. You pay for them in another way, but that's besides it. With the inevitable coming of AI, how would you see the business of type design in the future? Very similar to anything that is done by AI. It is automating the middle of the road, the average, not the interesting outsides, the new stuff. AIs make no new stuff. They make average, they make new combinations of existing stuff, something that people never thought of. But it's always within the range of how they were trained. There are exceptions to that. There are AIs that are trained coming up with totally new board games, or they learn Go or chess from scratch without knowing any rules. But that works because the limited set of rules in such games. So you can, if you are training an AI on Go, it can do a billion games per day or so to train itself. But you cannot make an AI training itself on imaginary pages, because it doesn't know if the pages are good or not. It doesn't know if the type is good or not. So training an AI on spacing or shapes or good pages or good logos would mean that you train it with a billion logos. We don't have them. You can train it with a billion images. That's easier, but not with a billion logos. You cannot train it with a billion good pages and try to figure out what is. So the training capacity of, by definition, of graphic design and type is much smaller than it is for other areas where AI is used. But of course, this could be me totally be old-fashioned, and 10 years from now I said that was a totally wrong remark. But as I see it, the experience that we have with it is that it's pretty easy to get AI working type design to an 80–90% level, maybe. So doing part of that. If you are making middle of the road average kind of type design and typography, then AI could be trained, because it's likely to have a lot of training material in that area. And then you get just another pretty good geometric sans serif that you really have to show people what the differences are. The question is that the kind of competition you have to be afraid of? And my thinking is that that's not what you should be afraid of. If it is work, I reverse the question. If it is work that that an AI can do your kind of work, then maybe it is not design work that you were doing, because it was mostly styling, filling in betweens of things that are already there, because that's what an AI is doing. Coming up with a totally new way of thinking, an existing product in a totally different market that nobody ever thought of, it's not something an AI will do. So that's the area where design is still there, I think. Open source Hoi examples. I'm not sure. I think the best is to ask and aware. But I haven't seen so many complete things. But maybe I'm out of date. What I saw is that they did demo projects. It's a really good idea. It's just the normal way of making a variable font is already a double lifetime. So if you extend that with that every axis has 3 more axes to handle, it exponentially becomes more work. So it may work for a logo, but to do it for an 800 or 1000 glyph typeface, I'm not sure, unless it's something that can be automated, of course, because it is, again, if you just use it as a storage format and partly the design is automated getting there, then it might be a good thing. But I'm not aware. I think the ones to ask is aware. We have a blog or podcast. Not so much. I have a Instagram that you can follow, and we have Design Space, which is developing into an open source of design assignments. And if you send us something, you always get a feedback. And if you want more, then we advise you to have a more official status in a workshop. But we're not a traditional business in that way. We're also teachers. The principles fundamental and independent of the technology used to implement them. I'm not sure, is that principles of type or graphic design? I lost track what that was. Oh, typography principles. Yeah, I can make a list. It's a little bit hard to put it on top of my head and know all the authors and the titles. There's some, so of course, there are rules of thumb, like the combination is contrast in typeface compared to the font size, compared to their line length, compared to the leading. That kind of rules, but each of them is okay, but it depends. Is it for a book? Is it for a website? Is it for an application? Is it for a signing system in an airport? Those are also influenced. So the principles is more what kind of parameters do influence good typography. And that's more or less the list that I gave earlier in my talk. And you can extend it, but if you take all the parameters in Type Cooker, like contrast and X height and ascender, descender, and all these things, so that the parameters inside the typeface, they are more or less embedded in the parameters of good typography. Because you can destroy good typography just by choosing the wrong typeface, and then extend it. So inside the typeface is not something like line length or how to mix different typefaces, or how headlines behave with the text is underneath, or if you have text and there's an image next to it, where do you align? So all these extended typographic parameters are totally independent from technology. And on the other hand, technology is guiding them. So the things that you can do if you work in PyCast in letterpress, and you have to work in points and inches on a screen, that is influencing what you can do. So the principles are independent because that's how we read. Maybe that's also changing. Like people are more used to reading from their iPhone, which was totally unacceptable 10, 20 years ago. And get that as a standard. So they maybe in time, young people experience books as having really long line lengths, and they're not used to that anymore. That is changing. But it's more the values of those parameters that is changing over time than the values themselves. All right. A good page, one that works. And then you can fill in what that means. And to show you why that is not a lazy answer. If the question is, can you make a page that shows really bad page design? Then a good page is a really bad page design, because then it would show how bad page design works. So a good page not necessarily says something about the quality. It says something about what it's doing compared to what it was intended for. And that can be very different. How do you decide who's a good professional partner to show your work to without getting stuck about worrying about the negative energy of others? I have issues with evaluating the value of my work. Yeah, that's a good question. That could be including educating your colleagues. Designing feedback methods is one way of doing it, and that could include designing the rules. You say, I want you to give feedback on my work, but let's play a game, and this list of 8 words you're not going to use. So you're challenging your companion to come up with other arguments. It's also that why we deliberately call it feedback instead of critique. Critique is pretty easy. You say, well, this is shit. This is awful, and then there's critique, but it's not something that people can do anything with. So feedback always includes sitting on the other chair, giving a message where other people can work with, and that actually building, describing a direction, not necessarily an end result, but it describes the direction of where to go next. Make a safe environment where you can ask any question, and you won't be bullied by the answer. That of course is a trial and error method in who your partners are, and it gets better over time. So that even that is a design process. But yeah, people you trust, people that speak the same language, but it helps to give them rules in words or in time they have, or kind of things you want to know. You only can say something about the color. I'm not interested in anything else. That already direct in a certain answer context. Yeah. I'm not sure if it's not a question. I already know about the typewriter platform. Get someone from the street and say, hey, you have these 5 words, which would fit best to this word, that kind of thing. So you direct them. Designing a good survey is a design process in itself, by the way. Which are the first things are the most important things to teach typography to students? Making it fun enough to bridge the gap between 0 and acquiring the skills. So, and again, it helps to think in processes instead of thinking in end result. You want to get them away from, if you're teaching third-year students and you say, okay, we have a new assignment, we're going to do a poster, and then one of the students said, poster, we already did a poster in the second year. Teach them why those kind of questions don't fit, why it is, and there's a lot of parallels. Unfortunately, graphic design and type design, the result is never shown at the moment that it's made, so people have no opinion from the outside, no idea how much work it is. Where in the performing arts, we all know we have an opinion about actors and about football players, and we can see that someone who just started playing violin last week is really not good. We don't have to be a professional violin player to recognize that. But to recognize good typography in a poster is much more difficult because you don't see it happen. So one of the first things I try with students is to make it short, to say you have, and limit it. So you have 5 words, you have 2 colors, and you have 1 hour, and then make something. And I'm keep watching you. And if you cannot stand that I'm watching you while you're doing it, while you think that if you're on stage playing a musical instrument works, you say I can play music, but nobody's watching, and just with my technical stuff, and then I'll show you after 3 weeks what the result is. The first thing, the important thing to teach typography students to make things that you can do in a short amount of time, and then ask feedback, and then do it again and again and again, and see it as a training. Music students should not complain about 1,000 times playing D minor scale or so. You say, oh, already played that, then something's wrong. So yeah, make it small, make it work, make it into an exercise, and then give them feedback, and then do it again. And then from there you get into questions. Okay, why is this line too long, and why is this type too small, and why you can better use a sans serif here, that kind of. But that's not rules they have to learn up front. If they have no problems to solve the rules in. Okay, two more. For screen design, seems 8 points is more often to be used as parameters like leading. 8 pixels, will they another way around to affect typography like type choosing? Yeah, maybe the pixels is maybe not necessarily best measurement because they depend on the resolution. As so many other answers, it depends so much. What do you want? If the one important thing that also affects the readability of a certain point size compared to a certain leading is the viewing distance. So if you're designing a page on an iPad, it will dynamically show the route in a building with arrows seen from 2 meter distance, and they want to make it into a dynamic screen, then 8 point is way too small. So that already assumes a normal viewing distance from, but 8 points also totally depends on what's the X height inside that 8 points. Because if you have a really small X height inside the point size, it looks much smaller than typeface with small ascenders, descenders. So 8 point is just an ordering number. What it looks like is totally dependent on the design. That you need to check that. So one 8 point is not looking the same size as another 8 point. If design is a process, if design is a process, is the output art? Well, if you call it that way, it is. There's no, but in my definition, I'd say that that art is a full 100% free. So there's no limitation. There's no customer. You can totally decide if you work on this painting for 20 years. So that would be the art side. The production side, and they're all different. So there's no, it doesn't have to be something up front. It is what it is at the end. Production on the other side, you're never going to buy a computer and you want to test them all. You open a package, one of them, or from a stack, and you assume that they're all the same, but they're not exactly identical. One will break earlier than the other, but you can never tell in the shop. So on production side, everything should be equal. And design is everything in between. In design is not 100% free because there is an assignment. So if you do an a design project, which is a poster for a gallery, and it has to have a certain image, then that is not art. But it's also not production because one poster can be different from another poster. Where if you do forms for a bank, as I showed, then they have to be different, but they also should be as much alike as you can imagine. So that would be more in the production area. I would not say it's art because anything you do, even artists, do have some requirements. If you do a mural, then the limitation is the size of the wall and the visibility of paint in our physical vision system. So even artists who say I'm totally free, I can do whatever I like, they are maybe on the edge of making the artist way of design, but they're also designers. In my definition, it is in the definition of this lecture. They make a painting, and next painting will get better. So I would reverse the question. I think that every piece of art in a way is also a piece of design, because there is a certain amount, even if it's really small, certain amount of requirements that has to fit in. I think that's the last one. Okay, Kara, can I give it back to you, or how you want to end? Thank you all very much for staying. I see there's still 138 here. So
You guys are hard.
Thank you for your attention and for your staying, and for, I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Maybe we see each other at some point somewhere in the world or another presentation or in the Type Lab or Typographics, anywhere. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody.